Sorry about my last lecture kind of cutting off. I had a technical problem. So let's just pick up where we left off. The second issue in 1 Corinthians is sexual immorality that we see happening in both letters, namely that Paul had to come down pretty hard on them. For the issue I've already mentioned, there was a man who was with his father's mother, and um, and that was significant, and the church wasn't doing anything about it. So this is another issue in the church, not just their disunity, but their sexual immorality. And Paul wants to stress that every sin is outside of the body, but sexual immorality isn't just a sin outside the body, it's a sin against one's own body. And this is significant because what Paul is going to do is he's going to talk um, about our bodies being a temple. And not just our bodies being the temple, but the church is the temple. And this is significant because when we engage in sexual morality, we are not just defiling our bodies, but we are defiling the very temple of God. Now, so in this context, Paul gives advice about human relationships and marriage and sexual sex in its right context. And he talks about this in 1 Corinthians chapter 7, namely, marriage is good. And in the context of marriage, and I know this is countercultural, but in the context of marriage, one man and one woman for life. That is the only context, according to Paul, where sex can be enjoyed and experienced so that all of its blessings are experienced. In any other context, like you could think of like pornography, or you could think about fornication, sex outside of marriage, like any other form. It's not the context where the blessings of this experience will be experienced. And that's why we laugh about this, like um, um, in culture, like in movies, where you'll see a guy and a girl hook up, and then the man leaves before the morning, right? Or the woman leaves before the morning. Like that isn't the context where the blessings of sex can be experienced. What's happening in sex is something really glorious. Let's think about this for a moment theologically. So you have a man and a woman who are naked, and there is no shame. That was the garden before sin. And yet, our culture, in popularizing and its infatuation on sex, creates all these contexts where there is nakedness and shame. And that's not the biblical model. The biblical model is striving for us to experience sex without shame in the context of a monogamous, heterosexual marriage for life. It's very countercultural, but let me just encourage you to adopt something so much better. The Church of Corinth was really struggling with this, and sadly, our culture is too. The third major issue, so we have disunity and sexual morality, is really an emphasis on the non-essentials. So we have this word diaphora. Um, they're focusing on things like knowledge. They're focusing on things like power. They're focusing on things about like what to eat. And these things are non-essential things in the gospel. Rather, as God's people, we should be resting in God's comfort, preaching the gospel sincerely, giving to gospel needs, giving generously, and not focusing in on these non essentials. So, the principles of life Paul really walks through is like living the way we were called, sacrificing ourselves for the sake of the church, and being an example to the gospel. This idea of self sacrifice, it's not talking about like asceticism or like harming yourself, but rather having the appropriate means coming from the appropriate motives. And we see Paul sacrificing himself, like we saw in Romans, so that he might win people. He might win Jews. He might win Gentiles. This is the way we ought to live our lives, not by focusing in on non essentials like what to eat and what days to celebrate and who has more power and who has better gifts. We should focus on living gospel centered lives like Christ, preaching the gospel, living in ways that honor Jesus, and treating people with dignity. Here we see Paul unpack his motives, and we do need to make up a little bit of time, so we'll keep going. The fourth major issue, so you have disunity, sexual morality, a focus on non-essential issues, is a perversion of worship. You have disorganized and competitive things happening in the church, as we've already talked about. Disorganized and just Lord's Supper that's excluding people. It looks just like worldly feasts, and that's happening in the Church of Corinth. The fifth major issue is a misuse of gifts. And Paul just says in 1 Corinthians 12 through 14 that if I had all of the gifts in the world, like if I gave my body up to be burned and spoke in the tongues of angels and had faith to move mountains, but have not love, I am nothing. And we need one another. It says in 1 Corinthians chapter 12, if the hand can't say to the eye, I have no need of you. We are a part of one body. We are, as the church, the temple of God. And we all have a purpose. And the Church of Corinth is misusing their gifts, putting value on some gifts and less value on others, and thus creating divisions. Rather, what Paul instructs us to do is use our gifts with love. That is the highest gift. And if we go about using our gifts for any other purpose besides love, we are nothing, and we're not building up the body. So if I use my gift of teaching or preaching, or if you use your gift of administrative skills or hospitality to make yourself feel good, to get fame, you're going to misuse the body. And again, that's so countercultural. We think in terms of church, of what the church could do for me. And we need to start thinking that you need the church, but the church needs you. And the church needs you to use your gifts. If you are a Christian and you're a member of a church, that church needs you to be using your gifts. We can't misuse our gifts by using them for wrong purposes or withholding them through casual attendance. Rather, our love for God and for His people should motivate us to use our gifts for God's glory. And finally, the sixth major issue is not focusing on the resurrection from the dead. And Paul just lays out if Christ did not die, then we're nothing. 2 Corinthians, we see a major issue being how we are comforted in our affliction so that we might comfort others. So God comforts us that we might comfort others, and others even more. This is really important. God has a purpose in our suffering. Talked about this in Job and in Lamentations, but it is to comfort us and that we might comfort others. Here we see more talking about in 2 Corinthians about church discipline. We've already alluded to this topic, but the need to discipline the church that we might be pure. Christians, we have victory. We have triumph in Christ. We have already become new creation, and this is a major theme about how we should be acting like victors because we are victorious, and we'll have to limit it to that. Paul's commitment in 2 Corinthians is all about proclaiming the gospel. Again, like we learned about in 1 Corinthians, he didn't come to baptize, but to proclaim. And I think we need to end our discussion of 2 Corinthians so that we can have time to discuss the other letters.